So here's what I actually looked into. I'm going to make a fair point that what I'm modeling here isn't any specific piece of legislation. It's more kind of the basic approach or an option of carbon pricing. It tracks very closely to any hypothetical legislation that would come out. And I'll also make the note that, and the same excuse that Congressional Budget Office would make, is that I can only model the question that I'm given. So I'm modeling the policy as it was described to me by the advocacy organizations out here. So all the results you're going to see are based on these parameters. They don't have to be the final parameters, though. You can change them if you want to have a different level, if you want to use the revenue in some alternative way, anything like that. So I'll start on the right. It's 3 different levels of price. Blue, gold, red. Blue and gold are the same, and then they split off from each other. That's why you don't see gold for a while. And blue is the lower one. So this is the price of carbon dioxide in the state. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in implementation because the next speaker will talk more about that specifically and about other regions, be it states or provinces in Canada that look at this. But by and large, because Vermont is a state that mostly imports these commodities, as far as I can tell, there's no oil or natural gas wells inside the state, there's no refineries. That means that you have to apply this tax further down the supply chain. And just to give some benchmarks of the relatively speaking the levels there would be here, $50 per metric ton. The math works out where it's about $1 per metric ton is roughly speaking 0.9 cents per gallon of gasoline, so it's about 45 cents roughly speaking. The idea of it, more than anything else, is twofold. One is you're using prices in the market to incentivize people to change their behavior. You're increasing the price of it, people will respond accordingly. Think of any commodity that you may buy, housing, healthcare, food, vacations, airline tickets, whatever it is. If it's more expensive, you're less likely to buy it, and you're more likely to seek alternatives or buy something else. So that's fundamentally one mechanism here, is price incentive. Second incentive is, because this is a price, because this is a revenue item, it's similar to a sales or an excise tax, it brings in revenue. And that revenue can be used for other policy purposes, be it locally or at the state level. That revenue also counterbalances any negative effects. We're looking at both the upsides and the downsides of this policy. Higher prices by themselves for anything are typically a negative, but we want to look at the net as a consequence of also having that revenue to be used for other options, and then also take account specifically of Vermont's economy and its structure. And the model we use to do it, this is a version of it here. That's the national one, just real quick. Indeed, this is actually Vermont. And just to give one proof of that, this black line here is the state's population, which is about 620,000. So it's Vermont in terms of its demographics, its industry mixture, and its geography. It's very specific to the state and its counties that we're looking at. This isn't some generic region. So the levels there are then recycled back into the economy. I'll do that next, but I want to talk about what this actually covers. It's covering liquid and gaseous fuels, but it does not cover electricity. It's a very long and complicated story with the RGGI program. It was decided in this case, for simplicity's sake, to leave electricity covered by RGGI, but not covered by this. This would be a supplement or a complement to RGGI, which already has the electricity sector. The revenues returned. There's some precedents like British Columbia, but I'll let the next speaker cover that. So the use of the revenue is breaking out by percentages here. And by color. So I'll start with the top, I'll start with the individual income rebate. This would be money directly returned to households. Not so much a marginal rate cut, but maybe an expanded personal exemption, or a refundable tax credit, or just a dividend check or something like that. It's some sort of return to households based mostly on a per adult or per capita concept. So everybody in the state gets a certain portion of the money back based on the size of their household. The 6% at the bottom, which I'll note is actually smaller than what most are talking about in terms of the supplement is. And this is completely true point. Most people make the point that the average low-income family is going to buy mostly necessity goods, housing, food, clothing, some minimum transportation and heating and the like. So their total consumption of energy as a share of their income is higher. A high-income household might buy more energy in total because they'll have a bigger house, they'll travel more, they'll have more vehicles and the like, more electronics. But it's a smaller share of their total income. Therefore, designing some sort of supplement to low-income folks to help protect them from the potential harms of this is an important part of these kind of policies. That's what the 6% is about. This could be a number of different things. It could be just a sort of direct rebate. It could be an expansion of the ITC. It could be an expansion of LOTI. It could be many different things. There's also one other key difference in the way that I've done it here, but again, it tracks similarly, is when we originally did this, the red category for corporate income cuts was in there. So this would be a rate cut, a marginal rate cut, or an expansion of deductions from corporate income tax. What now we're actually favoring is the green category there. So the idea of that is, not every enterprise or employer in the state of Vermont is paying corporate income tax. In order to benefit from a cut in it, you have to have some liability in the first place. And a lot of the state's economy, state and local governments, nonprofits, startups that don't have tax liability yet, businesses that didn't make profit last year, exports and the like, don't have corporate income tax liability. They do have employees. So as a consequence, it's a better way to reach the business sector as a whole, both for-profit and nonprofit, using an employment-based rebate where they get a rebate back based on their share of state employment. Some of this might be large hospitals or universities, which have a couple % of state employment. Some of this might be just a little retail establishment with 2 people. They get their share back there. And the last part at the top, the 2222121, is a number of options for using the money for state efficiency and energy savings. These are not necessarily fixed percentages that have to be stuck to in any sort of legislation. This is what we use as an example. So going through that, there's transportation efficiencies with electric vehicles and the like. There's an expansion of the solar tax credit. There would be weatherization programs, be it low income or just general market rate. All of those could be spread out differently. I'll also make the note here too is that sometimes carbon pricing favors a revenue neutral approach, such as the instance in British Columbia where no net revenue comes in, it's all back out. This is not quite revenue neutral because 10% of the money is used for state programs. Close, but not quite. And that's a balance, of course, you don't want to strike there. So all the results you're seeing are predicated on these rates and this disposal, this use of the funding. This funding, of course, these all have positive effects by themselves. And again, it's the balance. We're looking at the negative effect versus the positive effect of how is it watching. So very quick notes on the methodology here. I'm not going to go through all the little kind of modeling background. But the first thing to note about this model, CPAM, it's open source. So anybody who wants to view it can view it. I can show you the link online for it. It uses entirely DOB public data. And it's been used in a number of different states. I actually missed Oregon up there, and I missed Rhode Island as well for that matter. So it's been used in a number of different states and counties to do this assessment. What CPAM is meant to do, just qualitatively, is take account of price sensitivity. The price of a commodity goes up, people buy less of it, unless there's some very, very rare circumstances. The ramen noodles are the typical example of something like that. So if energy prices, whether it's fossil energy prices, increase, people are going to buy less of it. The system accounts for the fact that people tend to be pretty insensitive to energy costs. They'll typically just pony up and pay more. They won't actually change the amount that they're purchasing, at least especially in the short term. But longer term, when you account for the fact that energy is what an economist calls a non-durable good, it's consumed the instant it is purchased. It's like food. It doesn't last over time. A computer, you buy it once, it's going to last you years. A car, you buy it once, it's going to last you decades. Most energy is consumed with goods that last over time. Vehicles, housing, heating equipment, electronics, and the like. The thing is though, even those durable goods wear out over time. Cars don't last forever, windows don't last forever, houses don't even last forever for that matter in a lot of instances. So over time, when the existing energy consuming items, again, electronics, vehicles, housing, and the like, wear out or are renovated and replaced, this would mean that people have a slightly different price incentive over the years in terms of what type of vehicle they might buy, how they might build their house or heat their house, what type of industrial equipment they might use. That's the idea of this, is long-term incentives that cause a change in behavior with infrastructure that would have worn out, or equipment that would have worn out anyways eventually, as everything does. So that's the idea. Higher price generates a behavioral response. It's a weak behavioral response because that's just the reality of energy consumption, and it's one that slowly phases in over time. The other model is ours. I'm not going to go through every little box or equation here, of course, but the high-level concepts to account for inside of REMI is it's a comprehensive picture of a regional economy. So block one at the top. Output is the economy, it's GDP, its output is product. Surrounding it is government spending, investments, exports, and consumption. So it is the economy in terms of what's actually produced and what's actually purchased. Block two, Labor and capital demand. I'm assuming most of you have had jobs or will have jobs at some point in the future. When you have a job, what you're actually really doing is selling labor, and who's buying it is your employer. So the purchasers of labor are businesses, nonprofits, governments, and the like. That's what Block 2 is, the business perspective on the economy. So that's very important, and it's also included. Block 3 is demographics, including migration. So the border, quote unquote, inside the REMI model is open. You can move to different states, you can shop in different states. I'm not going to do a show of hands here, but just think amongst yourselves or your family and your friends, how many of you were actually born in New England or Vermont or your home county or your home city? It's usually a fairly small proportion. There's a lot of labor mobility within the United States. One of the reasons, kind of a small aside here, that unemployment rates in the United States in the long term tend to be lower than they do in Europe is because Europe is a bunch of countries that are the size of states, but they're not allowed to move between them like we are in this country. We have labor mobility in the United States. So while in the United States, if one state has a weak economy, young people are likely to go someplace else. In Europe, young Greeks, Italians, Spaniards, and the like have a more difficult time going to Germany or Sweden or anything like that. The model accounts for that moving inside our system, which is important when you're facing price incentives on the energy market. Block 4 is equilibrium concepts, so balance out the economy. Labor and capital should have the same return everywhere. Block 5 is also a very important one. It's called market shares, but probably the better terminology for it is competitiveness. If there's a change in cost or a change in incentives, how well does Vermont compete with the rest of New England, the rest of the United States, and the rest of the world? So what's really being changed inside of here for this simulation, just to point out, is consumer prices for energy, business prices for energy, which will affect real incomes and competitiveness, as well as output of the construction and retrofit related industries, disposable income for consumers, which becomes consumption, and then business costs on the other end. Businesses in this, I'm not going to pretend every business would have its cost equalized, but in theory they would have higher energy costs, but they'd also have a lower cost of labor. Those two would hopefully help equal each other out. And the two work with each other. So we're using the tax and the price incentive model to drive variables inside our system, and we're using underlying economic fundamentals in our model to drive the long-term forecast inside of their model, so they work in concert with each other. So that's the background and methodology. So now I'm going to talk everybody through essentially the results and some of the high-level implications of the same. So just start off with the great hit, the home run, is employment. You actually have on net slightly more jobs in the state of Rhode Island as a consequence of this than you would have otherwise. Sorry. Vermont, excuse me. Yes, actually yesterday. So, Vermont, Green Mountain State. And actually, it's funny to say that because they don't scale correctly either. Your guys are smaller than them, so Vermont has more employment. There's two main reasons for this, and I'll get to those in a second, but I'm going to talk about one first and foremost, because it's about 50-50 the major reasons here. So here's gross state product. This is the equivalent of GDP at the state level. This is the size of the state economy. So it's gone up. The main reason it goes up, we remember just basic economics, is when you import something, it's not made in your region. It's not made in your state or your country, which means it counts for somebody else's GDP. If somebody, I'm trying to think of an obvious example here. If somebody imports just a bushel of corn from Ontario, which is then consumed here on a feedlot or something, that would count towards Ontario's GDP and not as much in Vermont. You would get some retail and distributional effects around here. That is accounted for. But for the most part, that counts for somebody else. So remember my earlier point. Anytime anybody buys petroleum or natural gas products in the state, for the most part, the value added of that is coming from someplace else. The state doesn't have any extraction activity. It has no refineries, as far as I can tell. It has the closest refineries, Delaware River, Philadelphia area. There's some in Halifax, in maritime Canada. There is economic activity associated with local retail, so gas stations, and local distribution. The model accounts for that. So all the results are accounting for the fact that there is a local value added to the wholesale and retail part of the system. But the bulk of the value, the rule of thumb I usually heard is that for any gallon of gas, about 75 cents of it, or excuse me, 75%, so 75 cents on the dollar, is the actual refined product. So that's as it comes out of the refinery in Texas or Oklahoma, while about 25 is usually picked up locally. That can vary, but that's just a rule of thumb I've heard. So as this commodity becomes more expensive over time and people buy less of it, that means the state is importing less and less of this. And this is true of Vermont in particular, it's true of New England as a whole. Imports are subtracted from gross product, therefore gross product goes up over time. It's displacement of imports. Lots of states and lots of cities have the displacement of imports and the substitution of local industry as a pretty standard economic development strategy. This is a similar idea here. And as a consequence, with these extra dollars kicking around inside this state's economy, some of them are going to lead to more investment in employment and growth and all that. So that's where part of the jobs are coming from. It's just simply more dollars are kept local, which has positive employment effects. And you can see actually, they track closely with each other, though employment's a little bit lag, which is how the market tends to work. The labor market tends to lag everything else. We've had some recovery at the federal level from the recession and the financial crisis, but the labor market has lagged severely. That's just the general trend of it.
For give us an idea of scale, what is the current total gross state product per mile? About 20 million? Is that right?
Sounds about right. These changes here, I should note, they're all about 1%, roughly speaking, over time. The state's got a population of 620,000. It's got about between 350 and 400,000 jobs, which means if it's 1% would be 4,000 or so. So this is under 1%, roughly speaking. Gross product is similar kind of scale, between 0.5% and 1%, roughly speaking. Relatively modest change against the baseline over time, but it is still positive, which is an important result. And again, that displacement of imports is the biggest factor there. The second factor that's important, I'm actually going to skip a little bit ahead of this one, is this is the jobs by industry. So we're looking at different industry types here. So at the top, construction has the biggest effect. That's related to the dollars that were appropriated in this design to weatherization. That's the industry that will pick most of that up. Other services, it's labeled wonkily, but that also includes a lot of repair and retrofit. Like a lot of contractors and subcontractors to construction are in other services, so like plumbers, electricians are. So they're also affected by the weatherization effects. Working your way on down, it's pretty much all industries that are, one, localized. They're ones that are hard to outsource, quote unquote, and they're also all ones that are labor intensive. So to give one example of this, healthcare is something that is inherently localized just by its nature. You can't do that at a distance. It's also very, very labor intensive. It requires a lot of people. Think about a refinery in, say, a city like Houston, which might have 20 people working for it, despite the fact it produces hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of production a year. If you have a hospital of the same size, like a major university medical center, Houston's actually a pretty big medical city as well, that would have thousands of people working for it, not tens of thousands, so there's a consequence. So the industries at the top are the ones related to localized direct consumer spending, and they're also the ones that tend to have more human hands involved in them, as opposed to machinery and capital that's more distant in other states.
So do you do a calculation of what growth we would expect generally? What's the background growth? You said 1% over a fairly long
1% difference from what would have happened otherwise.
Right, so what would the normal?
The underlying growth rate at the national level in the model is basically 2%. And if you look historically, that's what the United States economy has done since the Civil War.
And so you don't have a growth rate for
Vermont is lower. It's lower because of your demographics. You're an older state, you don't attract as many immigrants. So Vermont's is lower, as a consequence someone else is a little higher, like in Utah or Arizona. So it's between 1.5 and 2, roughly speaking. So that's jobs by industry. I'll do output by industry or GDP by industry. This is a pretty similar trend. Notice it's kind of the same industries on top. There's some industries down the middle that are fairly neutral impact. A few industries at the bottom that have a negative impact on this. I'll point out state and local governments. State and local governments cost, because state and local government's a big energy consumer. They have a lot of equipment, they have a lot of buildings, they run a lot of buses and the like. Their costs were not quite covered by the employment-based rebate, but it's very, very close. So they're not quite a net neutral, but it's very close to that. Utilities is power generation. It's power generation and natural gas distribution and the like. The thing is, though, that wouldn't really lead to any fewer jobs, because to serve gas or electricity, you need to have the same power grid. You need to have the same people to maintain it. They're just not running as much stuff through it as they would otherwise. Transportation and warehousing is logistics-related industries, and yes, that does have a negative impact. But I'll emphasize, while these macro results are all plus 1%, all these downside results are no more than negative 1%, roughly speaking, over time. And I'll put this slide up here just to benchmark this as a second. This is the current, it's 2013, it's the most recent data, employment picture in Vermont, so which industries do people in the state work for. And as I said, the big industries are the ones that tend to be localized, and they tend to require a lot of labor. Healthcare is the biggest employer in the state, followed closely by retail and state government and local. Manufacturing is actually fairly large in the state. We'll definitely give that to you all. As a share of your state economy, it's actually fairly large, even compared to like a manufacturing stalwart like in Ohio or Michigan. But manufacturing, as I said a second ago, in terms of employment, is actually positively affected here. You have more manufacturing jobs because they're benefiting from that employment-based rebate. So their costs are neutralized. Here's real income. So this is household income. Accounting for higher costs. So this is real income. We're not just saying people get the dividend back. We're discounting it for the fact that costs are higher. And then cost of living. So this is the change in cost of living from what it would have been otherwise. Interesting point on this one here, it's about 0.5% impact. And inflation tends to be about 2% a year, roughly speaking. So cost of living every year goes up about 2% just naturally. Energy costs are an important part of the cost of living. But compared to housing, healthcare, education, entertainment, electronics, all these other things that people buy, it makes up only a small share of the total cost of living. So even if energy prices have gone up, this only goes up so much. To put this in context, this is as if you have an extra 3 to 6 months of inflation over the course of 25 years to 2040. So it's a relatively small impact on the cost of living over the longer term. Here's the impact on the different quintiles. Blue, gold, and red are the lowest quintiles. Green and brown are the highest quintiles. This actually, because of that low-income supplement, whatever the mechanism for it is, actually has a better impact on low-income people, and actually generates more jobs in this range, because a lot of the jobs created here are those localized service industries and construction industries, which tend to be lower half or lower 2/3 of job creation. But it's not like high-income jobs have been harmed by this substantially. They're still there. They just don't have quite the impact. So it slightly, very, very, very slightly equalizes income distribution by creating more jobs and income for lower income folks. Very, very, very slightly, but it doesn't do it technically with the extreme picture. And actually, one fun little result is the way most of you think, like, how did you get to Vermont? It probably had something to do with either quality of life, family, which is quality of life, but fundamentally for most of us, probably the determinant was labor market. Did you find a job? Was it a job that you liked, and did it balance with the cost of living that you have? The labor market is the fundamental determinant for most people of where they're going to locate themselves during key points of their life. Because there's more jobs available, the state actually attracts a few thousand extra people. And this would be not just young college graduates moving in here, but also their children being born later on and eventually attending school to become Vermonters, all things considered. Again, this is, if the state's population is 620,000, so this would be like right about here, the blue line would be 1%. It's a very small impact relative to a baseline, but it is still a positive impact because of the labor market. So that's the economic results. Now I'm going to go through tax revenue, so kind of what JFO would do with something like this, and then also the emissions. So here's the revenue from it. It slowly comes up because the tax is phased in or the price is phased in, but it eventually peaks and declines as emissions start to go down. So it's a lot of money. I know you guys, your budget's a couple $2 billion. It depends if you count federal matching funds or not, but this is a very appreciable percentage of the state budget. But there's two issues with it. One, obviously, it's pretty far in the future. It's 20 years from now that the money really starts rolling in as the price is phased up. And issue two is it's not a robust revenue source over time. It has that frowny face pattern and starts going down in the long term. So it's significant revenue, but it's a declining revenue source in the long term. And then the last one, emissions. So baseline is what the EIA, the Department of Energy has for New England. It's more of a New England line than a Vermont line, but I did make it Vermont scale. Just basically flat, if not a little downwards. You introduce the pricing schemes that I described to you, the pricing systems, and it reduces emissions. Part of this is, again, that price incentive, people just accounting for that price in their decision making. Part of it is the efficiency programs I described to you a moment ago. I'll also note too, and maybe I should have said this earlier, is one thing that's not present in the modeling I've done here is any sort of climate feedback. That is, none of the results in here depend on any assumptions or beliefs about climate science. It's purely a tax study. We have an income tax in this country. We had one during the Civil War, and we got rid of it afterwards. We got one during the First World War to pay for that war, and we just kind of never got rid of it, and now it's the cornerstone of public finance at the federal level. Most economists are not huge fans of income taxes. They discourage work, they discourage investment, they're hard to enforce, but it's what we have. The way I'm looking at this carbon price, because the model doesn't have any climate system in it, it doesn't depend on any assumptions or feedback there, it's just another item that we're going to tax. The consequences of it are just, there's no real justification for it, it just is. So none of the results you've seen here depend on any sort of climate effects, whether that's storm intensity and frequency, outside the slush storm we had last night, water availability, anything like that. None of that's present inside the system. It's purely, we look at taxing this commodity instead of taxing another commodity, which is called labor and capital, and seeing how the market works out. And because New England and Vermont is an importer of the commodity we're talking about, its GDP can't go up. Here's the cumulative savings over time, just this number over time. Here's the source. I would think this actually is an important point. Is the price response of the blue parts. That's what people are doing on their own as response to prices. The gold part at the bottom is what that 10% of energy investment programs gave you. So it's basically a 50-50 split. So that's where the actual savings came from. Half is from just the natural price response of the market, and half is because of the state programs. So that's the mixture we have in terms of what actually creates emissions reductions. So that's pretty much all. Like I said, economically, it's slightly more jobs. It's 0.5% to 1% from a baseline, but it is more. Most of that is because displaced imports. It's a lot of money for a state like this, but it's not a dependable one. Again, it's that frowny-based pattern. Emissions, I'm going to let that speak for itself. Again, I don't really have a stance for climate science there, and I just kind of put my cutesy little demographic one at the end there. Because of a stronger labor market, it actually draws more people in the long term. So that's basically it. All my contact information is on these sheets. I'm happy to talk to you before, after this, off the record, whatever, but I think it's time for questions.
Will this be on our website?
It should be. And I'll note that this is a slide deck version of it. There's actually a white paper version of it too, that's 44 pages long. That has a lot more detail and information and all that. So this is just me giving the the talk over lecture of it, but there's a full white paper report version of it. If you can't find it, you can. Sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. On a more boots on the ground type of study, what is your analysis per ton, metric ton of monthly cost? Can you repeat it?
Sure. His question was what was the actual rate, what was the cost per ton?
Right.
And it's this one here, it's this chart. So those three different colors, those three different lines are either 50, it's phased into 50, phased into 100, or phased into 150.
If we take the middle of 100 there, what is that in a gallon scale?
Roughly speaking, 90 cents.
90 cents scale. Okay. Could you tell me, is there any analysis of, for farmers, how many gallons of fuel would farmers use in Vermont per year?
Farm is one of the industries included in here.
And how much would their consumption be?
I don't know the actual specifics on any of that or any other industry for that matter, but farm is one of the industries that is part of the system, part of the result.
But at 90 cents a gallon would be a significant impact on farmers.
Yes, it's a significant cost impact. They'd be eligible to the same cost abatements and taxes that everyone else would, and again, they're part of the system. That's a good question in terms of what they specifically, in terms of fuel usage, would have and what their cost would be. I don't have that specific information.
Okay, and the other thing you mentioned, people seeking alternatives, and I know people hear this all the time from us, but along the Connecticut River, they seek alternatives by going into New Hampshire. Have you done any analysis as to how many folks go to New Hampshire? Because what we see on a regular basis is if we increase our gasoline tax, we have fuel dealers, gas stations that close in Vermont and reopen across the river. So we're losing jobs there, and I would be interested in how many jobs that would cost, and what this additional price would mean to that industry.
So I'll repeat that question. He's actually asking two questions. One is what would happen to essentially border shopping opportunities, particularly for fuels. The second one is a little trickier to think about, but it's actually how do households locate themselves? Because it's easier to drive a car across the border, fill it up, and drive it back. It's very difficult to drive a house that's hooked into natural gas or has a fuel oil dealer or something like that. So there's two issues there. And you're right that Vermont is a relatively open economy. I don't know statistically which it is. It's in the top 10. It's after like New Jersey and Connecticut and Maryland and Virginia, but it's high up there, relatively speaking. So first issue, cross-border shopping opportunities. The system includes gas stations as part of the retail sector. And then of course the wholesalers fuel oil as part of the wholesale and retail sector as well. And it has some limited ability to essentially say that how much consumer spending is in this region versus that region across the border, and understands the distance and the permeability is very high. So it's limited, but at the same time, I'd actually think that it'd probably be good for us, rather than a modeling exercise, more of a bottom-up approach to actually look at these kind of things as opposed to this one. But it does account for that cross-border shopping. The second one, and this is actually more important, is the model that we use accounts for cost of living when it comes to location decisions. I grew up in the Midwest. Housing prices are basically free there compared to the East Coast. If you look at only income and employment opportunity, everybody would want to move to major cities. The thing is, though, no one actually does that because they're very expensive. So something that annoys me like crazy about a lot of federal data about quality of life and income is it's not cost of living adjusted. So it makes the Northeast Corridor and some of the big cities in, say, Texas and California look very high quality of life, when in reality, they're also extremely high cost. And if you benchmark, new parts of New England, the Midwestern states, the southern and mountain states, their low cost of living, they don't look so bad anymore. And in some cases, they actually look better. So the issue I'm getting at here is the system accounts for location decisions based on job opportunity, but also the cost of living. Jobs can be very plentiful, but if it's an expensive area, that's going to deter people. So this here, because it increases the cost of living, and because some energy consumption can't be done across the border, you can't really move a house. Some people might choose not only just to drive across the border and shop, but entirely locate themselves in the next state and just commute in. That effect is also present in the system. And that one actually might be larger, because a person going to buy, I don't know how many trips a year, but say once a month, they fill up a tank, it's $50 a time, it's a few $100s. But imagine, instead of just trips across the border for gas stations, imagine its entire household and their entire income and the housing purchase, which is hundreds of thousands, and all their education, healthcare, everything else. That's a much, much bigger deal. One family doing that quickly overbalances dozens or even more families just shopping across the border on themselves. It accounts for that second one very, very, very explicitly. It understands people can locate themselves in New York, New Hampshire, Mass, and drive and commute in for their work here and take their paycheck home. That effect is absolutely present in the system because of this cost of living effect, and that is actually probably the bigger effect, relatively speaking, especially in the long run.
My final statement is, one of the things I think that probably does not show up is one of the realities that fuel dealers from Massachusetts and New Hampshire will cross the border and they don't report their sales in Vermont. So there is the house isn't going to the oil is coming to the house.
Right.
And that's a very big problem we're in.
Right. And fuel oil, that can happen. Natural gas, which is not penetrated as far into the state as it is part of the southern New England, but that one is heated, so that's different. But yes, that is one issue.
So you have, focused on, Mike and folks focus on the perceived added cost of a carbon tax. And the benefit of it is not as clear as the cost of it is. Can you?
Sure. So I'm based out of Washington, D.C., and one thing I've noted, it's a very human and the right thing, is people are usually much more connected and much more invested in something that exists, an existing business, an existing household, all these kind of things, than they are relative to something that hasn't come about yet. It's easier to care more about something that you can see and sense rather than something that you would anticipate. The funny thing about these results, though, is that that's kind of what it's asking you to do, is there's a relatively small number, and again, these are all small changes. They're all less than 1% either direction for pretty much everything, with the exception of emissions. Where there are a small number of jobs and employers and border issues that could be a concern here, but the net when you account for an economic model that's in use throughout the United States to account for these things at the state and regional level, comes out the way that I'm showing you here. A lot of, in some cases, and I don't want to use too many political terminologies here, but all the standard logic about tax cuts and cost reduction and supply side, all those things about reducing taxes here, comes into effect. That's what all these effects are in here, is that you reduce costs to balance it, it also happens. And I'll make one other note here, the British Columbia guy will talk more about this, but British Columbia is pretty similar to New England in a lot of ways. It's like Massachusetts, it's about the same population, it's dominated by one big metro area, so Boston and Vancouver, and they import most of their fossil energy. Almost all power generation in British Columbia is hydroelectricity, so they don't use coal or gas for that. The result I got here basically says this has a small effect, it's 1% or so. So I don't say imperceptible, but it's very small. While emissions are falling 10, 15, 20% or so. That result that I got modeling quantitatively here for an economy that is similar to New England's is exactly what's happened in British Columbia. Their economy, if you look at it, its growth rate compared to the other Canadian provinces is the same. There's no differentiation, while its emissions have dropped relative to everyone else. So the test case that we have of a New Englandish economy on the West Coast, the other side of the continent, comes out similar to this. But there's definitely a tendency to concentrate on what is had rather than what is not seen, which is what this is arguing about. It's easy to say that there may be certain jobs here or there that may be at risk. There's things that can be done from policy design and the use of the revenue to protect them as best you can. But at the same time, this is a lot of money in tax cuts and state programs, and that has these positive effects.
So, some of this is we're sort of jumping in without as much context as I'd like. But I'm just curious how these costs are offset by what Vermont offers also. How are the costs of this offset by forest sequestration, for example?
That is separate policy issues I'm not really familiar with, to be completely honest. A lot of states will have existing programs for efficiency or appliances or cost assistance like EVA. I know Vermont has that program. So those are all still on the table for something like this.
It's not really my question.
Yeah, that one, that's coming at it from a climate perspective.
Right, but that's why we're here.
I'm staying, I'll say agnostic is the word I use on the issue, because the modeling I do here treats this as a tax study, and that's purely what it is. I'm leaving the climate stuff off the table. I can't really help you there, and that's an intentional choice.
Right, it's just that has an economic aspect.
Yeah, well, and I'll note that obviously, theoretically, there could be climate feedbacks, again, sea levels, storm frequency, agricultural quality, all that could be part of this feedback. I've just left it out because it's a very complicated quantitative undertaking, and plus it means that climate science becomes part of the assumptions or the results, which is intentionally not part of it.
So I have a question. We talked about this 1% impact over time. I think we're looking at 2040 or something as to how we're. And this ramp, as I understand it, ramps up over a period of what? 10, 15 years. What happens during that 10 or 15 years to the kinds of things that you're looking at in 2040? What happens to jobs? What happens to gross state product? What happens to emissions?
That's what's reported. That's what's reported on here. It just slowly changes over time. And you can notice a lot of these curves. Notice a lot of them have kind of a ramp, and then they have either a kink or a flattening in the outer years. That's them responding to incentives until the tax flattens out, and then the response starts to flatten out. It's never quite gets there. It's always lagging, and it's always evolving.
So there isn't a worry that we should have in 2040 or something, I mean, in a year, there isn't some place where, the impacts would be sync somewhere.
That's actually possible, and in a few of the versions we did of this, some of the early ones that we did not release, we did different policy designs in terms of how we use the revenue, and it actually, in those instances, might have generated a situation where instead of kind of an upward curve, you got more kind of a swoosh, like a 90 curve, down and then up.
But you modeled it, you created something that
Yes.
doesn't.
We eliminated those cases because that's not what we want in terms of policy, so we went with something that didn't create that effect.
And so, I don't expect you to go into a lot of detail on your model. A model is basically a model. And what I'm wondering is, if you applied this model to any actual situations, you would expect to get a correlation. Has that been done, other than British Columbia?
So it's really hard to do it because there's always so much change in the economy. The only times you really get an instance to do it is where you have what I like to say like a steady state economy. That is, it's kind of, you've noticed the trend. It's flat or it's a steady growth rate or something like that. And typically, the only circumstances you get to check how a model like this works is when you have literal acts of God. And I have two examples. One is Hurricane Katrina. New Orleans is a pretty flat population, developing about the same way it always had. Hurricane hits, its population goes like this. Before the hurricane even hit, our client at Sandia National Lab had a Louisiana model. They were running this with the Department of Commerce and FEMA. And they basically, all right, if a hurricane hits, what's going to happen? We're going to lose a ton of infrastructure and capital, basically housing and like a ton of commercial industrial equipment. We're going to lose a ton of people. And then we're going to get a ton of rebuilding back. We're getting a lot of FEMA, relief dogs, we're getting a lot of construction activity, all that kind of stuff. And I remember, actually this made CNN when this report came out, I remember seeing it, where actually the curve that they found in terms of population and output, so basically the economy, so steady, Katrina, flat, slow recovery. If you graph that curve 10 years ago now, the correlation is like 0.9. It's very, very close. And this is a testament to Sandia. They're very, very good at what they do. But at the same time, the model performed very well when you had a clean break. That's issue one. Issue two is the Bacchanal Shale, where Montana and North Dakota have had pretty steady economies since World War II. Eastern Montana's had a population of 80,000 since the 1800s. All of a sudden, Bakken happened, now they've got a population of 120,000. When it started happening, applying out there to DOT, they wanted to figure out, all right, well, what's this going to do in terms of adding population and business activity? Basically, do we need to 4-lane certain roads? Do we need to pave others? And they went through and they ran it. They said, all right, if we get 1 million barrels a day, it's going to be this much drilling, this much extraction and movement, and we're going to need this many jobs. Some of those are going to be local, some of those are not. The people coming in and out from Texas, Oklahoma, and the like. And they ran it. And the curve they got, where the area goes from 80,000 to about 120,000 in 5 years, you graph the lines and they're eerily similar. We initially underestimate, long-term slightly underestimate, but it's like might become back. And they took that population data, put it in a traffic model, and figured out that actually we're still overbuilt in eastern Montana. We don't need to add 4 lanes and 2 lanes. It's been overbuilt for decades. This will use more of the capacity up. We really should devote our resources to the growing cities in the western front, like Missoula and Helena and the like. So there's 2 instances where we have a clean situation, not much is going on different, and it tracked itself fairly well. And I don't necessarily, actually can very, very quickly grab this slide. If you just want to look at forecast, this one, very next to the last slide, this one here. It predicts pretty well, all things considered, over the time. At least if you use our squares as a metric, and this is how economists benchmark these predictions.
Go back to you, and then Sam. Yeah.
So, I guess a couple of questions. One is, I wondered if one of the scenarios we modeled was reducing the capital gains tax and what kind of impacts that would have. And the second question is, what if all the states adopt a similar fee or tax? Does that change the model very much? Are we getting gains because we're letting the other states don't adopt the tax? And then my third question is, do we see, I don't know if this would be you or our next speaker, but would we see the same carbon reductions if gas prices just go up without any tax?
Okay. I'll get to 2 first. I've actually done a study, hold on, this will take a second to look, this is a big file, it's this one. And I'm not gonna go through it all right now, but we've actually done a national level study. It's not exactly the same policy design, but it's available on the website, persistence, violent lobby, carbon gain dividend, all that. So we've done a national study, and that's broken out by region. So the lessons for New England are probably pretty general to the states up here. So a national study exists. I won't go through all its implications right now, but yes, a national level study would be, or a national level policy, because you can tax at the point of extraction then, and because the federal government has control of imports and exports, because it affects the power sector much more, would be profoundly different than it would be a state or regional policy in the same as issue one. Issue two, actually, give me the next question.
The capital gains tax?
Capital gains, no, it's pure corporate income, just a marginal rate. Wasn't asked to. It had a fairly similar response though, because what it fundamentally does to our model is it changes the cost of doing businesses or doing business, whether that's labor costs, energy costs, taxes and overhead. It changed that. It just has a slightly different mechanism and it maybe affect different industries differently.
That's what I heard. I heard that there are some studies that look at carbon taxes that the tax reduction is a capital gains, and then you have an incentive to invest in non-carbon type industries.
Yeah.
And I wondered.
Nothing specific here. The only thing we have is that small solar tax credit. And then the last one,
Multi-state.
multi-state.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Thought that was what you said.
Yeah,
You
that-
already answered that, yeah.
Yeah, good idea.
My last question was, what's the difference between a carbon tax like this and just gas prices are going up?
Okay. Gas prices now, and I'm going a little small off the reservation here, but I don't think current prices are a long-term situation. Current prices are as they are, and I'm speaking because we have clients in the Middle East, are where they are because OPEC, specifically the Saudis, decided that's where they want them to be. Because they're trying to drive certain producers out of the market, specifically North American ones. All projections I've seen, EIA, the industry itself, the consultants involved in it, say that this situation is going to persist for a couple of years, and then the Saudis will not be able to pay for it anymore, and they'll have to let prices go back up. Long-term, like making any long-term predictions about energy markets is a fool's errand, we'll say that. But most people say the fundamentals, the long-term situation, that gas prices are supposed to be between $3 and $4, roughly speaking, in real terms. Like nominal terms will be higher than real terms. Which means that these changes don't necessarily have much of a difference when most people expect the market to head back up for oil prices sometime in the next couple of years, which is long before these things really kick in terms of policy here. But the idea is, even if it's, let's say, $2 gas versus $4 gas, and instead of going from 2 to 290, you're going from 4 to 490. It's still, you're expecting a price response there. And there's a lot of research and literature and econometrics out there about how sensitive are people to prices. And it all says they're insensitive, but they still are sensitive. There is a correlation there. And that correlation has held very nicely from the 90s when gas was under $1 and under 50 cents to now, where in certain parts of the country it was well over $5 at certain points. Nothing worth receiving here, given that Vermont's not a low gas price state, but it's not really high either. Nothing we're doing here goes much beyond what we've witnessed in states like California over the last. And their gas prices are high for a lot of reasons, as far as policy and otherwise, as far as demand, there's a lot of people there. But nothing here is really going beyond what we haven't seen before, and the relationships typically healthy. I admit that relationship is very simple, just this idea. You put a price of emissions that changes prices, that reduces demand. It's very simple, but that's intentional. We want this to be transparent about the mechanism which is working.
So if I can rephrase your answer, it sounds like you have a change in consumer behavior and demand if the price goes from $2 to $4 because OPEC changes the price. And you'll have an even greater change in consumer demand if the price goes from $2 to $4.90, where the extra 90 cents was due to the policy.
Yes. There's always a price response. Who creates it, whether it's through regional or national policy, or whether it's through OPEC and the Saudis decided, it's still always a price response. So the individual consumer, they are stuck with the price they are given. We have no control over it.
So, on your model, you have 3 lines. Those are the 3 different levels of tax.
Yes. Those 3 rates.
And you said, I think I heard you say that this will offset business costs because employment costs will be lower.
Yeah, that is, you take a certain percentage of the money, it's the green and the red, it would be the green and the red, roughly speaking here, and you rebate it to all businesses and all employers, which counts nonprofits and the like, based on their share of employment in the state. So if the state had 100 employees and this business had 1 employee, they get 1%. I'm not pretending it's going to be even between every company and every firm or even every industry. There's actually a paper that I was part of co-author on. It's not my section, but we did this exercise about what that actually would look like for Massachusetts. So not Vermont, but one down the road, where it looked at the change in costs on net. It would be between different industries based on, okay, they have to pay more for electricity, or not electricity, but natural gas and the like, but they're also going to pay less for labor because of that rebate. So the two are going to, in theory, net each other out.
So, and kind of the curious thing of the model is that the higher we set the tax, the greater the benefits.
Yeah, there actually is a point it tips over. The point it tips over, as at which point you run out of imports to displace wage, basically. That point's not where we've hit. Getting back to your point, actually, for that matter, is, again, going from 4 to 490 is nothing this continent has not seen before in terms of gas prices. Going, I'll say $1,000 a ton. So going from $4 to $15 or like $13, that's a much larger change. If you get that high, then I'm not nearly as confident in results because I don't have historical precedent to argue for why my numbers are what they are. So we're not advocating anything that large because that's beyond what we've experienced, but I would tell you that these results would tip over the other direction if you got to the point where it was so high that you ran out of imports to displace. I don't think, though, there's any realistic policy or something that would do that.
So, taking all of your models at face value, tell me what I'm missing that medium and high track so closely that you wouldn't recommend doing the medium until 2026 and then increase the tax to get the further benefit.
Medium and high are the same. Notice how the yellow line pops out of the red?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, they're the same, and then they diverge. We just picked 3 cases for sensitivity. They're not the same.
But you put, I mean, your last statement here is, you know, high and in 2040 means as much as X, but medium and high for the next 10 years gives you the same result.
Yes.
What am I missing that you wouldn't keep doing that until 2026, and then if you wanted the additional benefit, you would increase the tax?
It's theoretically possible that obviously, you know, the legislature can change the law and the rates every year as it wants to. Future ones will, of course, for that matter as well. So you could set up a program like this, have it go for 10 years and then flatten out and then allow future lawmakers to essentially decide what future rates would be. So it's just the semantics of the numbers here. Why wouldn't you? You know, that's.
But I guess what changes then? Is it something that you did for the first 10 years that pushes it up? Or could you theoretically get the same results if you change the tax further down the road?
Yeah. Yeah, essentially. There may be a little bit of anticipatory effects, but they're very, relatively speaking, small.
I think the answer is that the medium and the high are the same from you because you're slowly increasing the tax over the first 10 years. And then at year 10, you increase it to the high.
Oh.
Yeah, the yellow line is under.
So you do have the same tax, and then you, okay, so you.
Yeah, the yellow line and the red line are the
Okay,
same
I wasn't
thing,
understanding that.
and then they break here. It's just,
Okay.
it's Excel graphs that line up for each other,
Okay.
sorry. Sorry.
Okay, so I have a lot of skepticism about this because if you raise the price of gasoline because of the price of oil, I mean, that's gonna have effect, not only in Vermont, it's gonna have effect in New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Canada for that matter. If you put a tax on in Vermont alone, then you have an increased price, a significant increased price, that isn't going to occur outside of our borders. Yet our borders, unlike British Columbia, are relatively short. We border a number of different entities that aren't going to be affected by this tax. And I don't understand, I guess I don't understand how that can happen. it seems to me we would be disadvantaged a lot more as a state, because of our neighbors.
You're completely right about all those points. One, yes, Vermont is a more open economy than British Columbia, geographically. And two, all those effects you're describing that would have negative consequences are true and are present inside the system. But that's accounting for only one potential downside, as opposed to a fuller system of all potential effects and upsides as well, which is what this is showing.
So if there's a reduction in emissions in Vermont, or the only other state that does that, is there counterbalancing increased emissions in our neighboring states?
This is not a net national, it's a net Vermont.
I understand
So
that.
I would tell you there may be some slight bounce in neighboring states or even the rest of the country or the world, but it's very slight. The fundamental reason for emissions reduction here is not the movement of emissions, it's people don't want to buy as much because it's more expensive. If you don't want to buy it, it won't be produced. So that's fundamentally the reason. It's not that we're just jacking the price of emissions or jacking energy costs and then the factories go to Georgia. It's not that. It's people don't want to buy as much of it. And they're being rebated, the revenue from it is balanced them out.
Just a question I asked earlier about farmers. I pulled up a report from the University of Vermont Transportation Research Center. It's the Vermont Transportation Energy Report. And the farmers use about 7 million gallons of diesel on farm, that's not transportation. So we're talking at 90 cents, like $6.3 million.
Right.
And we tend to be very sensitive to the impacts on farmers. So I just wanted you to have that figure that it's 7 million gallons.
And that is a significant figure. At the same time, I will point out, of course, the revenues coming in from this thing are in the orders of hundreds of millions. So there's available funds to compensate. At least that's theoretically how policy design should be designed to protect those who lose better.
So Vermont likes to lead in a lot of things, but this seems to me to be something that would be better implemented on a regional basis, some of the regional greenhouse gas initiative. And I'm wondering, given the preservation of Rhode Island and South Lake and other places in New England, what is the reception in those areas? Perhaps we could build together and achieve something on a larger scale with less of a economic disadvantage for Vermont itself.
Right. There's always an attractiveness to a regional level one, be it New England or west or east of the Hudson or something like that, simply because they are, to an extent, a unit. They all have the same characteristics that they import these commodities, therefore they can displace imports. That's all true for the whole region. I'm not going to argue or talk about the coalition and the politics that it takes to get all these states together to do something like this. Reggie's got its own interesting history about how that all came together. Theoretically, a similar program at the regional level is possible. But just taking a kind of small historical aside here is actually one thing about Massachusetts is they really like being first on things too. To an extent, we have a country because they decided we would. So, if you look historically at any policy initiative, conservative or liberal, be it healthcare reforms the last few years, for better or worse, the welfare reforms in the 1980s, 1990s, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, abolition, revolution itself, there's usually state antecedents before a federal program comes into existence in most cases. Small aside that at the global perspective, this is not a huge emission reduction, but it's not a global perspective. But what Rhode Island, Vermont, Massachusetts, and friends in New England, and also Western Coast states, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, what they can do here is essentially set good examples and show that for them it works. You're right that obviously making some sort of regional partnership might be attractive, just the politics might be a little more complicated. I'm sure our speaker on British Columbia might be able to talk about that because there's been similar initiatives in Canada to try and put BC with the Maritimes or something like that across the country.
So your slide on job growth and job loss, I don't know if that was assuming a particular model having trouble understanding some of your sites. But let's just, so taking that one at face value as well, based on what, I don't know if you're assuming what's occurred in British Columbia or elsewhere, but where does that assumption come from in the transportation market? And for a rural state, does that have implications for what can or cannot happen? Or are you assuming that there's more efficiency, that people travel less? What do job losses like that look like in a rural state?
That's all accounted for in the system. The thing to understand is Vermonters buy more fuel than an average American, simply because of the dispersed nature of your population, which means long commutes and all those kind of things. You're actually lucky in some senses though, because while you guys might drive, you might have more VMT, you might drive further, you also have way less delay. So people in Washington DC might not drive as many miles, but they delay a heck of a lot more, and most vehicles are more efficient at about 35 to 55 miles an hour. So there's some things that counterbalance out, but yes, it's all part of the system, it's all part of the cost for businesses, it's all part of the cost of living per household, it's all inside the system, and it's Vermont, or at least New England specific.
So I just wanted to put like a personal face on how this might happen, because I don't think it's an immediate negative, as our senator Natasha was suggesting. To me, it looks like the price, for me personally, the price of gasoline might go up $1 a gallon. At the end of the year, I would probably get roughly that $1 a gallon back in my personal income tax rebate. And also during that year, I might decide to start carpooling one day a week. So I will actually get all the money back and start spending less, so I'll have a little bit of extra revenue. So I might decide to remodel my kitchen, which will then create jobs in construction. Is that sort of how the model
At the
works?
individual level, that's how I think about it. Like, it's literally individual consumer sees this thing as more expensive, changes some behaviors, whether it's carpooling, getting Corollas into the Camry, or working their way down a smaller vehicle, whatever it is. As a consequence, at the end of the year, they have more money left over for other things. The other thing tends to be per month, while the fuel tends to be equal. That's the driving.
So isn't that just true when it's fully implemented? I'm still puzzled by this.
There'd be a little like first year or two weirdness when people adjust to it and internalize it, but over the longer term, that's definitely true.
5 years out, what is the scenario? How much, and I'm asking, how much are you, with the middle one, for example, how much more are you paying per gallon 5 years?
5 years out would be, I'll say 2020, so it's 20 cents, it's like 20 cents or something.
It just doesn't feel to me like that's having that impact.
It feels like that, but you'd be surprised. Like, I could show you a fun graph of SUV sales and gas prices. One goes up, the other goes right down. Instantaneously opposite. They're completely inverse. It's really funny because SUV sales tend to be really low in summer because the gas prices are high, and really high in winter because gas prices are low. It may not feel that way, but we internalize these prices, whether we know it or not. And even if it's imperfect and it's slow and it's over time, over the aggregate of 625,000 people, something will happen.
You haven't done a lot, the environmental benefits, you can kind of factor that out.
Yeah.
But, you know, doing this and looking at a cost-benefit analysis, do you know what percentage Vermont is of the carbon emissions nationwide?
It's 10 over 5,000, whatever that percentage is, roughly speaking.
So it's pretty minuscule.
22.
So it's a very low number, so the price versus the environmental benefit in Vermont is pretty expensive.
Right. But that's only looking at that from an environmental perspective. The point of this is the environmental stuff I'm completely leaving out. This is taxable. And the point, a lot of people, this is a true point. You know, maybe if we all do something to be a benefit, but individually doing something could be costly, it's a prisoner's dilemma. No one wants to be first. This is a little different because now the other places aren't relevant because it maybe has some positive economic development implications beside all the environmental issues. That can be left aside. The prisoner's dilemma is real. That's what's held us back at a national or an international level, and will continue to do so. But for specific regions, cities that have certain industry mixtures or lack certain industry mixtures, even with open borders, and Vermont's a pretty open state, the macroeconomics of it could be, or regional economics of it could be a little different. Yeah.
So, I go back to the personal thing that Rebecca was just talking about. That's fine for cars, but you're also talking about all liquid fuel. So you're talking about houses. And, the average income in Vermont is pretty modest, you know, it's probably 50.
It's a little costly too,
Yeah.
nowadays.
So the problem with this, from a cost point of view, for low to middle income people is huge. I mean, the cost to redo your house is high, to weatherize your house, to bring down the fuel consumption. It's, to me, there would be it's very long term. How to get at that, to me, is a much more challenging problem.
A lot of these,
And
yeah, a lot of
the price
these,
on that is-
a lot of these phase in this report for 20 years. That is, even a house does not last forever, and even if the house itself
Our
lasts
house
a long
lasts
time. But the components of it, windows, insulation,
You
upholstery,
still have to pay.
furniture, they all need to be replaced eventually. They don't last forever.
You'd be surprised.
They don't last forever. So,
We have the oldest housing stock in.
again, old housing still can have newer equipment inside it, and the equipment is what fundamentally uses
But
electricity.
on the average income,
Yes.
the newer equipment is the price point is a challenge.
You're completely correct, but eventually even a low-income family that has a small, old, rickety house, eventually that furnace will give out, and have to replace it. They're gonna have to do it anyways. This is gonna change the incentives that are gonna happen. That, like, stuff does not last forever. If it has a moving part, it will break eventually. Best lesson my father ever taught me.
So we're about out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And like I said, all my contact information is on the cover of that thing. I think it's my old address, with the phone number, and the email still works. So if anybody has further questions or can't find the actual slide deck or white paper, let me know. I'm happy to continue this under any circumstances.
So now we have Professor Erickson from the Government Museum, who I think will get a little more in depth about a lot of the questions that we were asking about the impacts or the positive tax impacts. Thank you.
Welcome. Right. I like this committee already. The bathroom break.
We can go to the bathroom on our own.
So thank you for the introduction. My name is John Erickson. As Representative Klein said, I'm a professor in ecological economics in Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont, and also a fellow at the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics, one of our major research institutes at our state university. I have over 20 years of research experience specific to energy and climate change economics. It's the subject that I got my teeth on in graduate school, my dissertation on, and so it's wonderful to see old wine in new bottles. These subjects to come around again and again and again. A lot of my work in this area has been funded by Cornell University, by the National Science Foundation, and by San Diego National Labs. I want to first say thank you. Thank you to the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee for taking testimony this week on proposals for a carbon pollution tax. Thank you to the Ways and Means Committee for holding today's joint hearing to discuss the economic and fiscal impacts of, one, putting a price on carbon pollution. Two, this is very implicit in Scott's presentation, shifting the burden of our state's current tax system off the middle class and the most economically vulnerable in our state. And three, investing in statewide energy efficiency and our clean energy transition. The carbon pollution tax proposal being discussed today is, in the end, a very straightforward approach to fair tax reform, economic development, and reduction of our unsustainable reliance on fossil fuels and impact on our environment. The strategy is tried and true, and it's very simple. We want to put a tax on the things that we don't want, in this case pollution. We want to shift taxes away from what we do want, for example, jobs, and invest in the only long-term viable future for our economy, one without non-renewable carbon-polluting energy. So in today's testimony, I want to provide some of the big picture context. I'd like to first provide a broader context on the widespread support of taxing carbon pollution from the economics profession. Second, summarize the broad national and subnational experience with energy and pollution taxes, highlighting the recent experience of the Canadian province of British Columbia with taxing carbon pollution. And third, extend these lessons learned from decades of analysis and experience with carbon and other pollution taxes to the context of our state. First, I can speak from experience that it's often difficult to get economists to agree on just about anything. However, today, economists of all stripes have been lining up behind national and state level carbon pollution tax proposals. From the left to the right side of the political spectrum, economic advisors stretching from the Nixon through the Reagan to the Clinton and Obama administration have argued for carbon tax reform. Some of the more highly profiled figures include George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of Labor and Secretary of Treasury under President Nixon, and Secretary of State under President Reagan. Alan Blinder, former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve and member of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. More recently, Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury and Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama. Also Nobel laureates, spanning the range from economic philosophies from Gary Becker of the University of Chicago to New York Times columnist and Princeton professor Paul Krugman. And panels of economists that have been assembled over the last 2 decades to study the economic impacts of climate change. From research reports to op-eds, all call for tax reform that would put a price on carbon pollution to achieve true market efficiency, every economist's dream. Use the proceeds to shift the tax burden off the backs of the middle class, the so-called double dividend of pollution tax reform, and invest in economic competitiveness through a clean energy transition. These economists speak from an established tradition in my field. Hindsight. What you're seeing here is the attempt of some foresight, but it's much easier to sort of figure out what has happened in the past and whether it's been successful or not. Every nation on earth, and I can't stress this enough, every nation on earth taxes energy in order to invest in national infrastructure. Every nation on earth taxes pollution to discourage waste and encourage efficiency. And a growing number of countries have direct experience with carbon pollution tax, some now for over 20 years. We have a lot of experience to draw from, but unfortunately in recent decades, much of this experience in energy and pollution tax reform comes from nearly every nation in the world except our own, except the United States. So let me give you some context, and then we'll circle back around to what does this mean for Vermont. All countries have access to the same petroleum prices of international markets, but each impose taxes at different levels. As a general rule, richer countries have higher prices, while poorer countries and the countries that produce and export oil have significantly lower prices. One notable exception to that general rule is the United States. So the April 6th average price of gasoline around the world today, is $4 a gallon. The April 6th U.S. average price is $2.61 a gallon, 65% of the global average. The only countries with only higher, our current gas price is only higher than 23 other nations nationwide, and most of those are either OPEC countries or low-income nations. A little more context. Of the 28 member nations of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, only the U.S. has a gas price below $3 a gallon. Only the U.S. and Canada have a gas price below $4 a gallon. The current average price of gasoline for NATO countries without the 2 American members is $5.62 a gallon, more than twice the U.S. average. Perhaps not surprisingly, the US and Canada consume more energy per capita than nearly every other nation in the world, among a group of energy elites that include OPEC nations and a handful of small wealthy nations. Each average American consumes nearly 4.5 times more energy than the average global citizen. Again, not surprisingly, our CO2 emissions per capita are far, far above all but just a few nations in the world. All but one of the nations with higher CO2 emissions per capita than us are among that small group of nations with lower energy prices. In Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and then there's the US and Canada. If we focus on the richest nations in the world, the 34 countries belonging to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, the story of the US as an anomaly on the energy tax spectrum is even more revealing. The OECD recently did an analysis of the effective carbon pollution taxes of their member states. So looking at all energy-based taxes and converting those taxes, whether they were specific to carbon or not, converting those energy-based taxes into effective carbon taxes. What does the picture look like? In effect, the current range of federal carbon pollution taxes among the wealthiest nations in the world, among the OECD nations, ranges from $4 a ton to $141 a ton. So I'll give you some context of Scott's simulation there, of how this would ramp up. Still well within the OECD range. You might guess that the US is at the very bottom of this range, just above Mexico at $6 a ton. While the world outside of OPEC, Canada, and the US has been ratcheting up taxes on fossil fuels for decades, at the federal level, the US gas tax has been the same for over 2 decades, for over 20 years. Remember this number, 18.4 cents per gallon. It's been stuck for 20 years while the rest of the world keeps rationing up gas taxes to get off of fossil fuels. Now that's federal. As you know, all 50 states in the US tax gasoline, diesel, and other fossil fuels, all 50 states. In fact, the range of state motor fuel taxes as of April 1st, including both excise and other fuel taxes, and Vermont has both, stretches from 29.7 cents per gallon on the low end, that's Alaska, that's the lowest state fuel taxes, to 70 cents per gallon on the high end in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, California, New York are the top 3. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the range of current state gas taxes across the country, from 29 to 70. That's a 40-cent spread. Vermont is currently 1/100th of a cent above the national average. Okay, so some below us, some above us. We're right about the national average at 48.86 cents per gallon if you account for both our excise tax and our other energy taxes and put them together. Currently, as of April 1st. In the Northeast, we're below New York. Our energy taxes are below New York, below Connecticut, and below Rhode Island. We're about the same as Maine. We're about 4 cents higher than Massachusetts and 6.5 cents higher than New Hampshire. So New England together is in that kind of range of energy taxes that is within 4 to 6 cents of each other. Also, although the federal gas tax hasn't budged in over 20 years, it's important to note that state gas taxes have, especially over the last few years. Since 2013, 11 states have increased gas taxes, including South Dakota and Utah. Another 6 states have passed